You have probably heard that the Middle East is a very hot place, and of course we're not talking about the climate and local weather conditions, but rather about a series of military events that have taken place there over the past 50 years. One of these events was the Gulf War, which lasted from August 1990 to February 1991. This conflict is often referred to as the Liberation of Kuwait War, as Kuwait unexpectedly found itself occupied by Iraqi forces. However, the main event in this story is, of course, Operation Desert Storm. How did it change the course of the Gulf War, and what were its stages? Let's delve into it together. As we mentioned at the beginning, the Gulf War began with Iraq's invasion and occupation of Kuwait. But why did this situation arise? In July 1990, Iraq accused Kuwait of stealing oil from the Rumaila oil fields, which were located along the Iraq-Kuwait border, dating back to 1980. Iraq demanded $2.5 billion in compensation and the forgiveness of $10 billion in debt that Kuwait had lent to Iraq during its war with Iran. On July 31st, urgent Iraq-Kuwait negotiations began in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. A day later, these talks were interrupted, and on August 2nd, the Iraqi army crossed the Iraq-Kuwaiti border and entered Kuwaiti territory. Kuwait's emir, Sheikh Jabir al-Sabah, fled to Saudi Arabia. Thus, Kuwait was swiftly taken over by its neighbor. Naturally, the rest of the world did not want to stand idly by, and the reaction of other countries was immediate. During a meeting in Aspen, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President George H.W. Bush agreed on joint actions against Iraq. It was decided, relying on the United Nations Security Council and acting in accordance with its resolutions, to create a broader international armed force to confront Saddam Hussein and restore peace in the Middle East. Simultaneously, the aim was to prevent any possible actions by the Iraqi army against Saudi Arabia and the advancement of Iraq to the south to occupy the oil-rich states of the Persian Gulf. The United States began massive troop deployments under Operation Desert Shield as early as August 9th. Furthermore, despite 5 months of attempts to influence Iraq politically, a decision was ultimately made to conduct a large-scale military operation, which was codenamed Operation Desert Storm. On January 15, 1991, George Bush signed a directive outlining plans for a massive strike against Iraq if there was no diplomatic breakthrough at the last minute. Then, on January 17th, at 3 o'clock in the morning Baghdad time, Operation Desert Storm officially began. The United States focused on air superiority and an air campaign as their strategy. The goal was to deprive Iraq of the ability to continue the war. While large-scale ground battles were not initially planned, they were anticipated. The US and its allies assembled an impressive military force near the borders of Iraq. The coalition forces numbered up to 600,000 personnel, with over 4,000 tanks, more than 3,500 artillery pieces, field artillery, and mortars, around 2,000 aircraft and over 100 ships, including 6 multi-purpose aircraft carriers and 2 battleships equipped with modern Tomahawk cruise missiles. Approximately 80% of these forces and assets were American. They were equipped with the latest precision strike systems and military technology. Iraq had a numerical advantage over the anti-Iraq coalition in terms of personnel, tanks, and artillery systems, but it significantly lagged behind in terms of combat aircraft and ships, which was well known to the US and its allies. The initial stage of the air offensive operation involved massive strikes on key targets and troops in Iraq and Kuwait, suppressing the air defense system, achieving air dominance, disrupting the system of government and military command, and inflicting maximum possible damage on the southern deployment of Iraqi forces. In the second stage of the air-land operation, it was planned to bypass the enemy with maneuvering ground forces and marine units, simultaneously with the landing of numerous operational and tactical airborne units in the rear. The goal was to encircle and annihilate the Iraqi armed forces in Kuwait and southern Iraq. The developed plan did not set any time limits for the main stages of combat operations, and the overall success of the operation was directly dependent on the results of the initial massive missile and airstrike. As a result, Operation Desert Storm lasted for 41 days and consisted of an air campaign that took place from January 17th to February 23rd, followed by an airland operation from February 24th to February 28th. On January 17th, the aircraft carried out a sudden massive strike on targets in Iraq and Kuwait. During the first 3 days, the main efforts of the air group were focused on disabling air defense facilities, launch sites for tactical missiles, air bases, nuclear and chemical facilities, and subsequently, on disabling key elements of Iraq's military-industrial infrastructure. Before the ground offensive, the focus shifted to targeting enemy tank and mechanized infantry units in Kuwait and southern Iraq. Iraq's air defense suffered significant losses in the initial hours of the conflict and was effectively incapacitated. By the end of the third day, the Allies' air operation was completed. Summarizing the first 3 days, the command of the multinational forces concluded that the airstrikes should continue until conditions for a ground operation were created. Over the next few weeks, bombings continued continuously, with the Allies' aviation conducting an average of around 2,500 combat sorties per day. Starting from February, massive airstrikes were conducted against Iraqi positions in Kuwait and parts of the Republican Guard in southern Iraq. During this period, some of the important targets included the bridges over the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which connected the southern Iraqi forces to the rest of the country. On February 6th, the 406mm main-caliber guns of the battleship Missouri joined the aerial strikes. Resistance from the Iraqi forces weakened steadily, and the continuous bombardment eventually demoralized the Iraqi army. On January 30th, possibly for morale rather than practical results, 2 Iraqi brigades attempted a breakthrough towards Ras al-Khafji, but were repelled by elements of the U.S. Marine Corps. On February 15th, Iraq announced its readiness to withdraw its troops from Kuwait. However, the Allies had already shifted their focus to conducting a ground operation, and Iraq's intentions were disregarded. The ground operation began on February 24th, with the main goal of destroying the Iraqi forces in Kuwait and southern Iraq. The offensive was planned to advance simultaneously on 3 fronts. Additionally, on February 24th, the battleship Missouri began bombarding the Kuwaiti coastline, simulating an amphibious landing to divert the main Iraqi forces. At 4 o'clock local time, after artillery preparation, the multinational forces launched an offensive towards the cities of Al-Kuwait, Basra, and Nasiriyah. Attempts by the Iraqi command to halt the advance of the attacking forces through counterattacks were unsuccessful, as the second echelons moving up from the rear suffered losses from airstrikes. On the same morning, large airborne landings were made in the suburbs of Al-Kuwait to capture the capital's airport and on the islands of Failaka and Bubiyan. On February 27th, the territory of Kuwait was completely occupied by the anti-Iraq coalition forces, and the systematic destruction of the surrounded Iraqi group in the areas of Basra and Nasiriyah began. On the next day, at 6 o'clock, the combat actions ended with the complete defeat of the Iraqi army. What were the reasons for Iraq's defeat in this conflict? Unsuccessful command decisions, miscalculations in assessing likely actions on land, weak organization of combat operations, and virtually no coordination between units and formations also contributed to the defeat of the Iraqi army. Iraq's armed forces had no more than 10–15% of modern foreign-made weapons and military equipment in their inventory. The rest was mainly developed in the 1960s and 1970s and lagged behind the corresponding US and Allied weaponry by 1 to 2 generations in terms of capabilities. Furthermore, even the available weapons and equipment were not fully utilized by Iraq. For example, state-of-the-art aircraft were, for the most part, grounded at the beginning of hostilities. Another factor to consider is the effectiveness of any weapon depends directly on the preparedness of personnel, their professional skills, and psychological resilience. In all these aspects, the Iraqi army was not up to par. With the onset of ground combat, the Iraqi army essentially ceased to resist. Therefore, the potential inherent in the equipment of the Iraqi army was largely underutilized. Operation Desert Storm is officially considered successful since it became the key event in the war and led to the liberation of Kuwait. In a short period, the United States and their allies managed to assist the occupied state. However, the exact number of Iraqi soldiers who lost their lives remains unknown to this day. Some sources estimate that their number could be as high as 200,000, but the truth may never be fully revealed. Until we meet again, friends.